Welcome to our What Works series, where we provide practical advice from Eckerson Group consultants and clients soon to come. We do this every other Friday or so. We're now in our second series. This is our winter series, and we are glad that you are with us. Today, we are going to meet with Sean Hewitt, senior consultant here at Eckerson Group, who's going to talk about the art of valuing data or art of data valuation. So he's the third in our series. And we have three more after this, as you can see, with Rich Fox, Josh Reed, Carlos Bassi, talking about all topics of interest to you and your teams. So we hope you can tune in. And if not, listen to the recording after the fact, which we'll send you next week along with the slides. Just a little bit about Eckerson Group. All we do is data and analytics. We are global thought leaders, and we are consultants that focus on data and analytics. The thing that differentiates us is that we're a boutique firm. We only have senior folks with 25 plus years of experience in the data and analytics field. As a result, we can build highly tailored, bespoke solutions and collaborate closely with you. These are the areas that we practice in: a lot of data strategy, modern data architecture, data governance, operating models, data literacy, self-service analytics. And this is some of the members of our team. We counted up the number of years that this group has been in data analytics, and it was over 200. Quite impressive. And these are some of the clients that we've worked with in the recent past. You can see all sizes, brand name and not, both US, Canada, and Europe. So Sean and I have worked for many years providing services to clients. He's got over 25 years of experience in data analytics and development. And for the past, almost 10 years, he's focused exclusively on data governance. And he, in my opinion, is one of the best data governance consultants in the industry today. He's an IAPP certified privacy professional. And some of the recent clients that he's worked with are Kellogg, Brooks Running, Sandag, and IFC, a division of the World Bank. So, Sean, without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to you, and we will begin the conversation.
Thanks, Wayne. No, I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. One of the common challenges that we've seen over the last many years is trying to evaluate data. And we've been struggling for at least 10 years to come up with a standard way of doing that, and came to the realization that it's really not possible to come up with a standard that's going to apply uniformly across all industries, all organizations. So we've come up with an approach that can efficiently be implemented in an organization to standardize it within their walls, or possibly within an industry, a smaller industry. So some of the examples of requests that we've had that have driven standardization are organizations that collect a lot of data from external sources. There may be a request for new data. So an example could be, it could be data related to diversity, or data that might have some potential risk to it if you collect it and then you hold it and you're responsible for it. So you need to have a fact-based decision around, is the value of bringing that data in significant enough to accept the risk that comes with it. The other scenario is you have some existing data that is troublesome, right? There may be quality issues, it may be difficult to process, there's large volume, and you really don't know what value that's bringing. So we want to look at that and determine whether we should keep that data or remove that if it's not providing enough value. And then we can also apply the approach that we're going to talk about to data products. So this could be, an AI product. It could be a dashboard, a simple report, a self-serve query, something like that. We see a common problem where organizations have a huge backlog of requests for data products, and they need a efficient way to identify where the true opportunities are, so they're working on the right priorities. So those are all examples of where this need for data valuation has come up. So ultimately, we're assigning a strategic value to the data assets. And when I say data assets, I also mean data products to support decision-making and planning for data management activities, including analytics programs and things like that.
Yeah. So Sean, just a comment here. I mean, there's this common, I guess, mentality that, just bring all the data in. That certainly was the mentality during the data lake years,
For
right?
sure.
And they still be the same with the data lake house and even the data warehouse to some extent, right? Just bring it all in. The cost of storage is really cheap. But I think what I hear you saying here is that you really should evaluate the cost of, or the value of the data anyway, to make sure it's worth the effort of people and systems to bring it in. Is that a fair statement?
Exactly, and we'll talk more about data as a liability in another slide. But we need decision makers to understand that once you bring that data in, if you're not using it, if it's not generating value, it becomes a liability, and you need to understand how big of a liability is it going to be to really make a sound decision on whether to bring it in or not.
That's fair enough. So spoken like a good data governance consultant.
Well, it's about being realistic. I've seen so many projects where they say, oh, we're going to go out and start collecting all of this data. And I'm going to go back to the diversity thing. So a lot of HR departments right now are pushing to get increased visibility to the significance of diversity and their ability to accommodate in individuals. So then they're changing processes to collect self-identification data and things like that and bring it in, but they don't really understand the total cost of ownership for that data, and helping them understand that and really understand what value is that going to bring. If it's driven by regulatory requirements, okay, fine. But if they don't have a clearly defined use case that's measurable, they're getting into some really troublesome areas there around how to protect that sensitive information. And that's when you need to look at the total cost of ownership, the liability aspect of that data.
Yeah. And I do wonder, I mean, a lot of the conversations that we have around cost and data now tend to focus on the cost of Snowflake processing, right?
Right.
I don't have to pick on them, but they're very popular. And, the way data platforms charge these days, it's, per cycle, essentially. So they want all the processing. So I'm wondering if there's some intersection here between that kind of cost evaluation and the evaluation that you're talking about here.
Yeah, and the approach so that would involve a deep dive where you're getting down to the actual details of what the cost is, and even going one step farther and looking at what is the environmental impact of bringing that data in. A lot of organizations have sustainability targets now, so we need to start looking at data from the environmental perspective as well. What is the impact of the processing required? So if we're building an AI model, what is the environmental impact? How much energy are we consuming to process it? And how much energy are we consuming to store that data? And factor that in as well. But ultimately, this approach is more at a high level, so we can apply it quickly. There may be other needs to go down to a more detailed level to get those exact cost numbers and things like that. So this does not.
Yeah. This is not really a FinOps exercise, as people call it. And to be fair to Snowflake, if you're just storing it in Snowflake, it doesn't really cost money. It's only when you query it or process it that it costs.
Right.
So
but there is still a cost. There is still the environmental cost. So there is I can't remember the exact calculation, but for every gigabyte you're storing, there is an amount of energy used just to store it in the cloud.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear from our audience if they have any experience or exposure to that type of thing in their organizations. As Sean said, that's a growing concern. And by the way, everyone, please chime in. If you have a question, please add it to the Q&A tab and we'll get to it. We'll bring it in. All right, why don't we move on, Sean? Let's see if I can push the right button. There we go.
So the approach we take, and once again, this applies to whether it's a set of data or a data product, we need to identify the stakeholders. Once we've done that, we need to pull them together to identify the the positive aspects. And so the first step here is setting up our standard. So what are the positive criteria we're going to use to score the data or the data assets? What are the negative criteria that we're going to use? And then once we've done that and standardized those and scored data sets or data products against those, we can determine a net value. And then once we've determined that net value, we can translate that into metadata and put that into our data catalog. So, the net data is a calculation, but the value score could be, depending on what we call it. I typically use a value classification, and which is a grouping of high to low. And we have an example of that later. So that's the approach to standardize what we're going to do, and we'll get more into each of these. But then it's a very similar approach to executing. So when we're executing the scoring, once we've established the standard, we identify who are the stakeholders we need to engage to get an idea of what the scores are, because we don't want to do that in a silo. We might be missing something. We identify what those scores are for the positive criteria that we've standardized. Then we do the same for the negative. Then we calculate the score. Then we update the catalog with the value criteria.
Perfect. So just to qualify again, we're not talking about the valuation of a solution that you might be building to determine whether it's worth it for the company to fund this new product. It's really just focusing on the data assets that
you could actually use it that way. And I have seen it used that way, specifically for data products, right? So if we're building a dashboard or a series of dashboards or an AI product of some sort, we could use the same approach. We might have separate set of criteria that is specific for analytical products versus a raw data set.
Okay. So, and also just to be clear, before we get into the scoring of it, and one of our listeners has asked you to elaborate on the positive and negative aspects, this is not an ROI exercise. We are not coming up with a financial valuation, a dollar.
No, we could talk about ROI as one of the aspects, but it's more of a subjective, a first pass so we can make a quick decision on whether or not we need to go down this road or not. And we will dive more into both the positive and negative aspects with some examples.
Yeah, so this is going to be an interesting methodology to learn. I'm just wondering if it's been out there long enough that you've understood the receptivity of it by CEOs or CFOs or CMOs, right?
Typically, we're not seeing it used at that level. It's more from an operational perspective. So director level, management level, who are going through and trying to kind of get some, really identify where the priorities are. It could be used at a higher level, but once you get up there, they just want to understand the logic behind the decisions you're making, not the ins and outs of this process.
Okay. Well, let's move on. I'm sure people are interested to hear how this methodology works.
So just to reiterate, we start with the business input. So, we need the right people involved so we get an accurate reflection of what the data is. And then we need to get consensus, because quite often you'll have different opinions on, whether or not something fits one of these criteria or not. And then, the standardization is very important, because once we establish this criteria, we need to lock it down, because we want to compare apples to apples. If we start changing it, so let's say we go through and we evaluate 50% of our data assets that we need to evaluate using one set of criteria, then we change it, then it's apples to oranges, right? So, maybe you change it every once in a while, but then you have to go back and ideally reevaluate some of those other ones. I wouldn't suggest that we evaluate everything. You need to be selective, because it does take time to go through and have the conversations to do it. What I would like to see is some of the catalog vendors come and incorporate some of this into their tools, so it can predict. So using the lineage, predict what the value is of some of this, because they can look at where is it used downstream and other factors, especially once you start looking at some of the knowledge map technology and stuff, if you can link it to quality metrics and all of that, you could probably come up with a calculation that would do some of this.
Well, that's assuming that the data is you already brought it in.
Exactly. So let's say in this case we have, these are actual examples of criteria established by one organization that we worked with. That organization, 80% of the data they worked with, they acquired from external sources. So when they were looking at making decisions around whether to bring that data in or go through the effort of collecting it, these are the things that were important to them. And ideally, we keep this list of criteria relatively small. So I would say no more than 15 items, because it takes time to go through and evaluate that. So you want to put a lot of thought into this. So these examples, for most organizations, if the data is critical to the delivery of goods and services, then of course it's going to be of significant value, right? Especially if you can't meet customer expectations without that data. The data is used for financial reporting. For some, depending on the organization, that's more important than for others. It's used for strategic planning, forecasting, data monetization. We'll talk about that more near the end of this, but at this point, we just want to know, do we think it's possible to even go down that road of monetizing this data that we're going to collect or that we have? So these are just examples, but every organization will have a different set of criteria. And that's where we've struggled to come up with a universal standard, because what's important to one organization is going to be very different from the others. At best, I think we could create a standard within a certain industry.
So Sean, these all look like really interesting questions to ask, right? So I'm wondering that these could be things that every organization asks, I would think.
Yeah,
well, I'm concerned about the one that says data is difficult to replace if lost. I'm just wondering who's losing data out there.
Well, if they had to go out and survey customers and pay to get that data, and then for some reason that data is corrupted or something, or the quality is not there, what is the impact?
Yeah. So Connie asked, do you find that, I think you answered this, that the aspects positive and negative are quite specific to an organization based on what kind of organization it is and what matters to them?
Yeah, the values. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is a good start. I mean, this is a good straw man.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, this could even be the starting point for discussion with the stakeholders. So when you bring people together and start deciding what are we going to use for criteria, you can start with something like this and then have them go through and refine this and add things that are missing that are important to that organization.
Cool. Okay. We'll go on, move on. Okay.
So it's also important to have a standard scoring methodology for this. So we're using a Likert scale, and the positive criteria was all presented in a positive tense. So to line up to the scoring methodology. So when we say something that like the data is of high quality, we can say, yes, 100% certain, we know that data is highly trusted, 6. Or if we're not quite sure, then maybe it's a 3, that data is of high quality. Okay. And then the definitions are just some guidance. It is a little tricky to have some people wrap their heads around this type of scoring mechanism, but we've tried many different methods of scoring this, and this is the one that seems to work the best.
Okay.
And then it's the similar scoring or same scoring method to the negative. It's just the questions for the negative are posed in a negative way.
Okay. Yeah, looks like a good Likert scale.
So here's an example of how we've applied this. So we did the same questions. In this case, the client wanted to weigh the criteria, which you can do. It creates a little more complexity. It changes the mapping of the score to the metadata, but it does work if you want to go down that road. So we brought these stakeholders together. We went through these, got consensus on what we think the score is, and then in the end, we come up with our net value.
So this is for, in the client example, is this for a specific piece of data, for instance?
Yeah, so this was, they went through, they identified several sets of data for this program that they wanted to evaluate. And they went through and did this for each set of data. Then there were also sets of data that they were thinking about bringing in, and they did the same for those.
Okay.
So this is where you get into being smart about where you apply it, because you can see it's unrealistic. If you have thousands of data sets, you're not going to apply this to all of them. So this would be more to support decision making you have on data, where you're going to spend your effort. It could be to help guide data quality initiatives. It could be to help guide standardization, metadata or master data management initiatives, things like that, or the expansion of data. So, if you have an existing data set and you're looking at adding additional values or, data points in that data set, you could quickly go through this process to look at the value of those data points. So you might have one user, one business function requesting those data sets, and on its own, it doesn't seem to have enough value. But then if you start looking a little broader, go through this process, you might see that there is additional value that it could bring in the future.
So, we've done this kind of scoring on a personal level when you want to make a career decision, or,
Yeah.
Should I marry this person or not?
Right. Right.
And it's always dangerous to do that by yourself, because you can certainly manipulate the data and the weights to get the answer you want, right? And I've even seen that happen in groups as well. But I'm wondering, when you've done this with clients, I assume this is a team exercise. So I'm wondering if you could describe the team and how long it takes and how many people are involved.
Yeah, in most cases, it's a team exercise, usually done, in a Zoom meeting or Teams meeting. We can go through, let's say we're doing this for an AI product, right? We want to determine whether there's enough value, if there's value of bringing this AI product in, and we want to assign a score to it. Then, so we could go through this. It could take 15 minutes. Usually it takes no less than 15 minutes per product that we're looking at, but it really depends on the complexity and the dynamics of the room, the personalities in there, and how long it takes them to come to consensus on a single point. Other times it could take an hour and you still don't get consensus on what those are. We're looking at ways to build this into a more efficient way, where you kind of do it asynchronously through survey tools and stuff like that. It's just a little more to set up, so you're kind of shifting effort from one place to another. But the real important thing is saving those stakeholders as much time as possible. So the vision is get it to a point where it's asynchronous, and they're just doing little pieces here and there when they can.
So one listener asks, have you or can this scoring be used to help identify CDEs, critical data elements?
Yes. Yeah, you could apply that at that level. The trick is, you could have a lot of candidates for those critical data elements. So it's best if you kind of group them into sets and then evaluate those sets, because you want to make sure that the amount of effort you're putting into it is justified.
Got it.
So we try and do it at as high a level as possible.
Okay. Ready to move on?
Yep. But before we start this next conversation, so the main time I see it used for critical data elements is when we are making significant changes, either adding new critical data elements, or what we think will be, or modifying them and looking at just getting this evaluation to help us understand the prioritization of some things.
Paul asks, so who is the arbiter on these scores? Take your example of DEI data. Many people who want to collect it will totally underestimate the risks of collecting and holding it. This is true.
Yeah, and that's where, ultimately, if you have data governance resources, they come in and help facilitate that conversation, try and get to a consensus. Yeah, that can be a challenge. Sometimes we have to escalate it up, especially if there's a decision involved. What we would do is we would just gather those arguments and escalate them up to the executive decision makers to make the final decision. So at that point, it becomes less about the score and more about documenting those risks. So we might have to get into a little more detail. But you're right, that happens a lot, that the people requesting it really don't understand the true cost of ownership related to that data. So I mentioned the concept of data as a liability. So these are some examples that we use, but same thing. So each organization can customize the criteria used for the liability offset here. And in the past, this is where people were neglecting. Right? They would look at, what value does the data bring, or what value does that data product bring, but not looking at all of the aspects of the downside. Now, since GDPR and stuff like that, we're seeing more awareness around personal information and managing the sensitivity and the regulatory requirements required with that information. So even if you're taking existing information and duplicating it, you're creating additional overhead. Especially if it's personal information or sensitive information of any type. Once you duplicate it, then you have to monitor it in that new location and make sure the stewards are overseeing that information. There's access control, there's auditing, all of that related to it. So, we want to be cautious, but we don't want to be paralyzed, right? So that's kind of what we're trying to get at here, is an agile way to really be aware of all of the factors without getting paralyzed in the process.
Okay.
So, things like, is the data expensive to procure or use, or is there licensing required where we have to monitor the use to make sure it's used in alignment with the licensing agreements? If it's very difficult to clean the data. So we see a lot of scenarios where people are buying market data, bringing that in. It doesn't quite meet their expectations. So then they have to fill in some blanks. They have to standardize it so they can line it up with their codes, their product codes, to see how they're doing and incorporate that data. So yes, there may be a business need there, but then maybe the business need isn't significant enough to justify the full impact of bringing in that data.
Okay, so another question, Sean. Curious to know more about data that's difficult to cleanse. Would that pose additional risk to the organization because it might be unreliable? I would think so. How can one mitigate this so that the risk is not transferred to a new quote unquote data solution?
Yeah, that's the question, right? Is if that data comes in and you suspect that there could be some data quality issues with it, you need to understand what is the downstream impact and then make a decision around what corrective actions or monitoring do you need in place to control that, right? So let's say we're bringing data in and there's only one source of data that we can get to fit this need, and we understand the limitations. We understand that there's once a quarter with this information we get weekly, there are some quality issues that can impact the decision making downstream. So knowing that, we need to define a control plan. So we're really getting into data quality management at this point. So we identify where the potential failure points are from a data quality perspective. We define a control plan on how to identify when there's a quality problem in that area, who's responsible for resolving it and what they're going to do, and then what are the communication plans around that. So, it's all in planning and putting the processes in place, stewardship processes in place to capture that problem as soon as possible and react to it before it has a significant impact on downstream processes and people. Hopefully,
Sean, the liability offset score 52. So you're a data governance guy, right? Everything's about context and metadata. So is 52 good or bad?
It really depends on what the positive aspect is. And that's really what the net score is. So we calculate our net score. Now, I've had some feedback on this saying that, we should have the same number of criteria for the liability as for the positive. I don't necessarily agree, but if that organization had other ones that fit in there, then that's fine, because it's not, life's not equal, right? Not everything in reality is equal. So, if there are more positive criteria, that's great. If there are more liability criteria because of the nature of your business, then that's just the way it is.
Okay. Why don't we
But
move on?
the weighting might be different overall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So all we're doing here is some simple math. We take the positive, we have 84. We take the negative, subtract it from the positive. We get our net value, which is 34. So you can see, so the requester, if they're looking at this and looking at the data with rose-colored glasses, they're going to say 84. That's a pretty good score overall. I think we should go ahead and do this. Then, from the governance side, from the operations side, we start looking at this and saying, oh, I don't want to deal with all the headaches that come with this data. Now we have a number that we can say, okay, this, our score on our side is 52, just to deal with the data, and that's not even building all the infrastructure and stuff to support that. This is just high level liability. Then we have our net score, and then the next step. So if you click your button again, we'll get the actual scoring logic there. Yeah. So then in this example, we've created some metadata values for a value criteria or value classification in the catalog. And then we have a mapping. So 32 is low score, right? If we had looked at 84 would have been moderate. So we might have gone ahead with it if we just looked at the positive. But once we factor in the liability aspect, it's actually on the border of being very low in terms of the value that this is going to bring. So by getting it in the catalog, then you can use it as a reference to help in planning, right? When you're looking at protecting data and things like that, and doing your data quality evaluations, things like that, you know where to spend your time.
Yes, maybe you could talk a little bit about how this might be used in a data catalog as a number, right? Another attribute of a data object, right?
Yeah.
People see this and they're like, oh, okay, so what's the action they're supposed to take,
So it's a reflection of the potential that this data has. Now, one thing here is when the criteria, it's worded in a way where it could be the potential value, not necessarily the actual value, right? So the data has the potential to be used for a wide variety of things. If it doesn't actually get used for that, it still becomes a liability. Right. So, we've all seen cases where there's been a big push to bring in additional data in either from our source systems into the data warehouse because it's seen as highly valuable and they're going to use it for all kinds of wonderful analytics and stuff. It gets brought in and it never gets used. So if in doing that, we're just creating additional liability. So here with the classification, the criteria, we're looking at the potential value and potential liabilities. We're not doing an assessment of the actual value it has at this point in time.
Got it.
So this tells you where the opportunities are to use data to drive that value and to create actual value, right? So if you're looking for new data products or data that should be marketed out to the business, then this will help you identify where those opportunities are.
So, Sean, if the net score was actually 42, not 32, then your equation would, according to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, would give you the meaning of life, right?
Exactly. So, that's what we strive for, is that 42.
Okay. All right. Let's move on here.
So I quite often get asked, what about monetary value? And we had one criteria under positive saying that, asking if the data set or product could be monetized. anytime somebody asks me if we can start calculating monetary value, I push back and start asking why. Why do they want to do that? And usually there's no immediate need to do it. And it's highly complicated. And my perspective is that it can't really be done well unless you know who the potential client or buyer of that data is, because it's very subjective, and most of that subjectivity is on their side. What are they willing to pay to get that data? And I have a lot of wonderful things in my garage that are of high value to me. Most of them are related to cycling. If I try and sell some of that stuff to my neighbor, he's going to think I'm nuts, because I'm going to be asking a couple $1,000s for a bicycle, and he thinks it's worth $50. Right? So it's really driven by the perspective of the buyer, not the seller. Unless it's data that's commonly exchanged in the marketplace, and then you have established pricing for that, then that's fine. But in a lot of cases, it's not. And 10 years ago, when people started, really, there was a big push to monetize data, and we get less of this now, but it's still occasionally get asked these questions. So really, it's a matter of who's going to use that data and how are they going to use it. Like, what value will that data bring to them in their business? Is it being used to drive new business products, get new sales? What is the revenue it's going to generate for that organization, or the opportunities that it's going to generate? Can they get that data from other sources? If they can, then you would be charging less money for that data. If they can't, then that increases the monetary value. Is there an economic benefit to that client or to the public from this data? Right. So this is something that I've seen in a variety of sources where they talk about the public benefit of data when looking at monetization. And then what is the risk to us? So if we start providing that data, and we're expected to provide that data on a weekly basis, and it has to meet certain quality criteria, it includes potentially sensitive information that we are accountable for, they go, what is the cost of that? And then offsetting that against the potential monetary value that we could generate from that data set.
I talk to a lot of data leaders who say, or work in organizations that require that whenever you propose a new data product or data solution, that there be a quantitative value associated with that. What's the ROI to the company?
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be growing, that drumbeat. And, people I've talked to said, yeah, it's hard, but you can do it. You just have to get creative. And
the problem with that is there's no follow through. There's no monitoring of, did that product achieve the ROI?
Well, hopefully,
in some cases, yes, you can assign a clear ROI to a data product, but in other cases, that data product may be purely strategic, and it still has a lot of value. It's just not really saving. It might not be optimizing processes and reducing costs and generating revenue, but it can still add significant value in one way or another.
No, I would agree with that. I mean, the coarse-grained data products that are meant for external customers would be easiest, as you say, but a data product that's a component for a developer who can reuse it instead of having to write script from scratch, how do you monetize that? I mean, you can say, well, it saves this amount of time, and I suppose you can do it that way. So maybe I just answered my own question.
Yeah, that's a good example would be, if you ask them, ask your finance people, what is the ROI on having a balance sheet, right? Every organization needs a balance sheet. I would have said P&L, but I think there's actually, I guess there's no ROI on P&L, but what's the ROI in having your standard financial reports? And they can't tell you. It's impossible to tell you, but they need it, right? And it does bring value from a decision-making process and all of that. So the same argument could be applied to a lot of the analytics that we're doing. But ideally, if we can attach an ROI to the data products, then we should.
Yeah.
And we should follow up and really monitor that ROI and demonstrate the value that these products are bringing. Because in a lot of cases, we're seeing that the products get built and they get built well, but then they don't get adopted, right? That last step isn't taken of really driving those products to generate the value. It's, handed over to the business stakeholders, and then they play around with it a bit, but then it never realizes its full potential. So it never gets the ROI.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to I think this is the last slide. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. You might have to click there. So ultimately, just three main takeaways. So, this data valuation approach, or any approach for data valuation, can help, but primarily it's helping kind of organize data assets, data products, so it's easier to manage and make decisions about them. It's not something that you want to apply universally across all data assets, data products. It would not be sustainable. But if you can come up with a very light way to do that uniformly across everything, please let me know, because we will want to push that along to other people as well. Ultimately, you need to really keep in mind that data can be a liability. Data products can be a liability if they are not fully adopted and achieve that desired goal or outcome. There's the change management aspect, the quality management aspect of these data products. It takes a lot of effort to build and sustain these things. So we need to be clear about the value that is going to be bringing before we go down that road of delivering them. And then last, the logic needs to be aligned to business processes, and it needs to be standardized. So this is our validation logic. If we don't standardize it, it's going to be meaningless, because you're going to have different teams using different criteria for evaluating their products, and you will never be able to do that cross comparison. You could have different criteria for different sets of, you could have one for your analytical data and a separate one for data products. But within those domains, you should have a standard approach so you can compare apples to apples.
Well, terrific. Sean, thank you for your time. And it's an interesting methodology that I think will be valuable to our readers and listeners.
Excellent. Thanks, Wayne.
Okay. And just to finish up here, folks, join us every Friday. This is a Monday. I know this is kind of the exception to the rule, but next time we're going to have Rich Fox talk to us about effective ways to turn analysis and insight into action. Rich is a former Chief Data and Analytics Officer at numerous companies, and he's got an interesting methodology himself for defining KPIs that are actionable by an organization. So stay tuned to that on April 5th. And then you can see we've got two more after that, one on data literacy by Josh Reed, and one on the medallion architecture, essentially creating zones in your cloud data architecture to facilitate data processing and access. So with that, Sean, thank you so much again, and thank you all for listening, and we will send you the slides and the recording next week. If you do want to schedule some time with Sean, please put something in the chat right now, and Julie will take care of that.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.